really quickly, guys, we're just going to go ahead and get started, and hopefully other people will kind of like dribble in as we go. So how's everybody doing this morning? Okay, good? Okay. Yeah. No, today's rhetorical day. I'm just going to answer everybody's questions for them. Especially his. Now, no, really quickly, today is actually kind of a unique day today. Today is the reason I'm doing this lecture series altogether. See, it was actually, how long ago was that, Rob? Almost a year ago.
Almost a year.
Almost a year ago that I put together the idea of if we were to do like some kind of a presentation or lecture on America being a Christian nation. And I came to Rob about it, and Mark and Rob sent me an email and said, yeah, we like this, why don't you come on in? And that's where I got the whole hook around my neck of Rob saying, how about we do a 12-week thing on the history of the church? But it originally started as this. Because what I normally do is, with this gentleman over here, is one of the things we do is we teach elementary school history, including we specialize for 5th graders, we teach the American Revolution. And so the one thing is one of the things that we actually are allowed to talk about because we're private contractors is, well, that whole separation of church and state thing doesn't necessarily apply to us because we're brought in, and not only brought in, we're paid. And so the one thing is that we don't have a problem talking about America as a Christian nation. In fact, we're going to talk a lot about this today. But one of the things is this is, in essence, the original lecture that I put together before Sherry got sick. And then when Sherry got sick, Rob said, you don't have to do this, it's fine, and stuff like that. And then after Sherry passed, I said, no, I want to do this. So this is the lecture that we originally put together. Really quickly, one of the things that I always found very interesting is that how people always thought of America. And we think of it as, up until, I would say, very modern time, America is not a Christian nation. But we're going to cover roots and talk about how it is and where these roots are. And so the one thing is it's not going to be just me lecturing today, because I can lecture about anything, and through lecturing I can convince you of anything, as of course a lot of modern historians like to do, revisionists. But we're not going to be doing that. So we will be talking about history, but even more than that, we're going to actually be reading some of the words of these actual people and what they thought themselves. Not so I can interpret them and tell you this is what they believed. We're actually going to read that and find out exactly what they did believe. And so probably the earliest, of course, the Mayflower. Yes?
Today's the anniversary of the day they arrived at Cape Cod.
At Cape Cod.
In 1620.
In 1620. Yeah. That's how come I think it's one of those things when you talk about divine providence, there's a reason we're doing this lecture today, because we're coming up on Thanksgiving weekend.
So they went right into a heavy winter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't always get to choose when you get to be political and religious refugees. And so what happened is that you have these groups of Puritans that all bind together and sail to uncharted lands. And of course, they land in Cape Cod. And in 1620.
Cool.
And so, this is the beginning of America as a Christian nation. And it's so easy to say this because they're religious refugees, but even more importantly, what's known as the Mayflower Compact. The Mayflower Compact is the first set of a proclamation set out by these people on how their government shall be set up. And so, I'm going to read to you the Mayflower Compact, signed the 11th of November, 1620. In ye name of God, amen. We, whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of the dread sovereign Lord King James, by ye grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc. Having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancements of the Christian faith and honor and of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and presentation and further of the ends aforesaid, by the venture hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we under subscribe the names of Cape Cod, 11th of November, and year of the reign of our sovereign Lord, King James of England. And that is the beginning of Christian America.
Cool. That's awesome.
Okay? It's unrivaled. It's like I dare anybody to come across something and say it's not. And out of this comes the blossoming of these colonies. After they actually make it through their first winter, other colonies will come. Okay? And by the 1730s, okay, this is the becoming of a new nation. By the early 1700s, the population of America has actually overtaken the population of England.
Wow.
Yeah.
Because of immigration?
Immigration.
Absolutely.
Not.
And procreation.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Procreation, yeah.
Now, out of this comes what's known as the Great Awakening. At least the first Great Awakening. The second Great Awakening happens in the early 1800s. But the first Great Awakening is a Protestant religious revival that happens in both England and in the colonies. It's an evangelical movement. It basically focuses on taking away it's not eliminating the idea of ritual, but it's actually inspiring people to have a more intimate relationship with Christ, to where it becomes a deep sense of spiritual conviction, redemption, and also it changes the morality of the colonies and in England itself. And it's also a very important social thing that happens in New England at that time as well. It challenges established authority, and it causes also a huge thing between traditional Protestants as well as what will become the Reformed Church, and it'll actually even sever even more the Baptists with the Methodists. We'll talk about Methodism comes out of this time period as well. But the only people that it won't really affect is it won't affect those Anabaptist movements. Well, first off, it won't affect the Lutherans too much because they're more like the Anglican Church in a way. But it also will not affect Quakers and other people like that as well. Now, this actually changes a lot of Christianity at the time period, and including it starts at the birthplace of religious institutions in America. Harvard University is a religious institution, like it or not.
It was.
Original.
It was. Thank you. Harvard actually starts up very, very early in America. Harvard University actually starts up as simply a school, of course, and it goes all the way back to 1636.
My goodness.
Earliest colonists. And the one thing is that it now today has its slogan is Veritas, which means truth.
Boy.
Hmm?
They can turn that sign around now.
Yeah. Well, the only thing is What was its original slogan? Christi Gloriam, for the glory of Christ. And then this is what's known as the placard outside the Johnston Gate. The Johnston Gate is actually a prominent brick gate in order for you to enter the grounds for Harvard University. And that placard has actually been there since the early 1700s. And so this is what the placard actually says in its entirety. It's in two parts, so I have a picture of what it is in the first part. So I'm going to read to you what is on this placard outside of Harvard University. It says, "After God carried us safe to New England, and we built houses, provided necessities for our livelihood, near convenient places for God's worship, and settled a civil government, what are the next needs we longed for and looked after was the advanced learning and to perpetuate it to its posterity, dreading to leave the illiterate ministry of the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. And as we were thinking and consulting how to effect this great work, it pleased God to stir up in the heart of one Mr. Harvard, a godly gentleman and a lover of learning, then living amongst us, to give 1/2 of his estate, it being all about 1,700 pounds, towards the erecting of a college, and all his library. After him, another gave 300 pounds, others after him casted more, and the public hand of the states added the rest. The college was by common consent appointed to be at Cambridge, a place very pleasant and accommodate, and is called according to the name of its first founder, Harvard College." Okay, Princeton. Okay, sorry, this is actually Yale University's, which is Truth and Light. And it was actually originally founded in 1701 for the purpose of training congregational ministers in theology and sacred languages. And it wasn't until 1777 did they pursue secular education.
Wow.
Pay the bills.
Yeah, probably. Princeton. Originally founded in 1746. It was actually founded by Presbyterians. That school's motto is actually still its motto today. It's probably one of the most conservative of all the original universities. And its motto is, "Under the protection of God, she flourishes."
Wow.
And it wasn't until 1812 did Princeton actually have to open up a separate school just for theology. So they actually remained very, very prominent in theology all the way up until the 1800s. So let's talk about some of these great movers and shakers of the Great Awakening. We're going to start with Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards is from 1703 to 1758. So he actually died fairly young. One of his most prominent quotes was, "I wish to lie low before God as in the dust, that I might be nothing, and that God might be all, that I might become as a little child."
Wow, that's cool.
Now, he actually, the reason we know so much about Jonathan Edwards is that because he was meticulous in everything that he did, he wrote about. In fact, several of his journals were actually published. And that's what's very cool. He wrote a great narrative called The Surprising Work of God in 1737. He also wrote another book a few years later in which thousands were moved to the preaching. Including, he will influence, the next person we're going to talk about is a gentleman by the name of George Whitefield. But he will actually become one of the reasons that Whitefield comes to America is because of Jonathan Edwards. Edwards, his books will actually inspire many. And one of the things I think that's very interesting is that when Whitefield actually came, one of the things that Edwards actually offered to him was he offered him the pulpit, say, "Please come and give a sermon at my church." And I love this. This is actually what Jonathan Edwards said about George Whitefield. He said, "The congregation was extraordinarily melted, almost the whole assembly being in tears for a great part of the time. The whole assembly included Edwards himself. Now, for the next few years, he actually moves throughout Massachusetts area, and he is actually a missionary pastor to the Native Americans in the area. So he converts a lot of Native Americans, and he's actually brilliant as almost an apologist. And he actually said, it is argued that we are free to do whatever we want, but we will never want to do God's will without a vision of his divine nature imparted by the Spirit. His most famous sermon ever, in fact, I had somebody come by and I said, hey, have you ever heard of Jonathan Edwards' most famous sermon? And I started to say sinners in the hand. She goes, of an angry God. Has anybody ever heard of this before? Okay, Baptists love this one. It was actually published in 1741, and it's still actually published today. So the whole sermon is actually called Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God. And he said, at the beginning of it, he said, there is nothing that keeps wicked men at any moment out of hell but the mere pleasure of God. And so out of this sermon, he made 10 points. And I think it's important that we talk about these points, because this will actually be part of the fuel for the Great Awakening. This is what he said. God may cast wicked men into hell at any given moment. There's one. The wicked deserve to be cast into hell. Divine justice does not prevent God from destroying the wicked at any moment. 3. The wicked, at this moment, suffer under God's condemnation of hell. 4. The wicked on earth, at this very moment, suffer a sample of the torments of hell. The wicked must not think, simply because they are not physically in hell, that God, whose hand the wicked now reside, is not at this very moment and as angry with them as he is with those miserable creatures he is now tormenting in hell, and who at this very moment do feel and bear the fierceness of his wrath. Yeah, we're getting on 5 now. You can feel the trend coming. At any moment God shall permit him, Satan, stands ready to fall upon the wicked and seize them as their own. 6. If there were not for God's restraints, there are in the souls of wicked men hellish principles residing which presently would kindle and flame out into hellfire. 7. Simply because there is not visible means of death before them at any given moment, the wicked should not feel secure. 8. Simply because it is natural to care for oneself or to think that others may care for them, men should not think themselves safe from God's wrath. 9. All that wicked men may do to save themselves from hell's pains shall afford them nothing if they continue to reject Christ. And 10. God had never promised to save us from hell except through the contained in Christ through the covenant of grace. This actually became one of the most famous sermons during that time period, and it was published and it was scattered throughout the colonies. So after Jonathan Edwards actually becomes one of the most prominent people in both England and the colonies, John Wesley. Okay? John Wesley is actually born in 1703. He's actually born into a strong Anglican home. His father is a priest, and his mother actually taught all the kids at home, all 19 of them.
Ouch.
I'm surprised they survived.
Wow.
Yeah. So Wesley is, he's admitted into Oxford, and he becomes a fine scholar. He's actually ordained an Anglican minister. And while he's at Oxford College, he joins a group that's actually started by his brother Charles, what became known as the Holy Club. And it was actually kind of a derogatory thing that people pinned on them. But what it was the Holy Club actually got together, and they actually they promised that they'd spend 3 hours every afternoon devoted to Bible and other theological practices, as well as they visited prisons and tried to better the life of their community. What a horrible thing that must have been. But out of that, young George Whitefield is raised. And actually John Wesley and George Whitefield will later come against each other in a very unique way, mostly because Whitefield is a Calvinist, believes in predestination, while Wesley does not. So that'll become a major schism for him. But what happened was John Wesley actually came to America and started becoming a pastor in Georgia. And he actually tried to take the influence of the Holy Club out of Oxford and place it on his congregation. His congregation wanted nothing to do with it. And then this young woman that he was actually courting in Savannah decided to marry another man. So he felt dejected by both the colonies and this one woman, and so he will return to America. He'll return to England. Now, the only thing is that he will actually meet, and both Charles and John Wesley will then become mentors to George Whitefield, and they will give him something that no other education could at that time. They gave him their library, the power of books. And so all this theology and stuff like that Charles and John Wesley had collected their entire lives together, they passed on to George Whitefield. And George Whitefield absorbed this huge amount of information. But the one thing is that Wesley didn't like Whitefield's kind of like willy-nilly, kind of like out there in the fields preaching kind of thing, but he eventually started seeing the fruits of his labor in a way. To the point that John Wesley himself will then take the ideas given to him by George Whitefield, and he'll actually start preaching out in the fields as well. And because this was a new way of thinking and a new way of reaching out to the middle class, they called this Methodism. John Wesley will actually become the founder of the Methodist faith. He's also known as a great organizer. So it's actually his organizational skills which allow this early faith to prosper. George Whitefield himself. This is not a flattering picture of him. In fact, it's very hard to find a flattering picture of George Whitefield. Okay?
That was the best you could find.
That is the best I could find. One of the things that was very interesting about him was that he was a cross-eyed. Yeah, so Whitefield went to Oxford in 1732, where he originally met the Wesley brothers. And the one thing is that without having a pulpit, Whitefield was actually out preaching in the fields. And he had a huge gathering. Welcome, Fred. He had a huge gathering of people that would always come to listen to his sermons. And so both in England and then later when he comes to America, he will raise huge amounts of followers. And the one thing that I have to say I do not like about Whitefield before we continue about his accomplishments, Whitefield is pro-slavery.
Pro-slavery.
Now, no.
Not me, Wesley.
No, George Whitefield. See, the one thing is, and when you think about it, it actually makes, I'm not going to say it makes perfect sense, because there's nothing about slavery that makes perfect sense. But they're looking at it, we have to look at it from an 18th century point of view. The first place that Whitefield is a pastor of is in Georgia, just like Wesley. The economy of Georgia is faltering. Why? Because they don't have slaves. They have indentured servants that come from Europe. They didn't have, slavery was not throughout the South always. But Whitefield noticed that South Carolina, the colony just to the north, was prospering just fine. Why? They had slaves. And so he kind of just basically said, well, if we expect Georgia to prosper, then slavery must continue. It's kind of sad, but again, we look at it from an 18th century mindset. We can't look at it from a modern mindset. But that is probably one of his faults, is that he didn't have a problem with slavery. Now, the one thing that was actually very interesting is that Whitefield actually picked up a very interesting friend when he was in America. Benjamin Franklin. Why? Because Whitefield's a writer. Franklin, he's a printer. And he printed tens of thousands of Whitefield sermons for him. And they became fantastic friends. Even though Franklin is known as a deist, even though there are several things that Franklin will say throughout his life that will counteract that, but he himself actually declares himself as a deist. Are we familiar with what deism is? Do you want to say something about deism, Rob?
It's like a watchmaker view of God, where God wound up,
The
creates the watch,
and let it go.
winds it up, and then lets it go, and he's uninvolved with creation from that moment forward.
Yeah.
Versus theism, where you would say that God is intimately involved with his creation still to this day.
Now, the only thing is, but as I mentioned several times, Franklin will actually go against that viewpoint, including in several addresses that he'll make as both a man and a politician, because boy, both of those are different. Now, the one thing is I love the story that Franklin actually heard of Whitefield being able to draw large crowds. And so they decided to hold a grand experiment. And the experiment really was that they would go to what he thought would be one of Whitefield's greatest speaking engagements, and Franklin would be next to Whitefield's pulpit and then walk away and say, okay, I can hear him fine. How many people are here? And he'd guesstimate how many people were in the area. And then he'd keep on walking, and he'd extend his circle of how long it would be before he could walk past the crowds and no longer hear Whitefield. And then from that, he would determine on how many people were actually at this engagement. He guesstimated at one of Whitefield's sermons, 30,000 people were there to listen.
Wow.
And the one thing is this is what Franklin actually wrote after this experiment that they conducted. He said, "It was wonderful. Change soon made in the manners of the inhabitants. From being thoughtless or indifferent about religion, it seemed as if the world was growing religious, so that one could not walk through the town in an evening without hearing psalms sung in different families on every street." This is like a picture of Whitefield actually speaking. This is from an early 19th century. We have a couple fifth graders that came and joined us.
Cool.
So, hi guys, how are you? All right. So, so they actually became lifelong friends, as well as they actually were said that they were known for their true loyalty based on genuine affection coupled with a high value placed on friendship. And also, you can actually still read their letters today. They're actually at what's known as the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. But one of the things that's I thought was very, very interesting was there was actually an orphanage for boys that was started up by George Whitefield, which became known as the Charity School. And in 1749, Franklin chose the Whitefield Charity School with an attached meeting house to become what would be later known as the Academy of Philadelphia, which opens in 1751, which then, of course, will later become the University of Pennsylvania. And then, if you go there today, at the dormitory quad, there is actually a statue of George Whitefield. Now, Whitefield was actually coined as being America's first cultural hero. And I love this. And in 1770, he's 55 years old, he will actually travel throughout the entire colonies. 55 is actually very old at this time period. And so he's preaching to the colonies, and he actually said he still preaches as if he's still a young man. And he actually said in a letter to a friend, he said, I'd rather wear out than rust out.
Oh.
Good idea.
And the only thing is that he was asthmatic. Yeah. And so they actually called it at that time asthmatic colds, which brought about great difficulty in his breathing. Now, it didn't help that he kind of let himself go as he got a little older. And from a newspaper article talking about him when he died, actually said this. This is from one listener who was there for his last sermon. That he was actually gave this last sermon in a field, standing on top of a barrel. There's your pulpit in colonial America. This is what he says. The speaker says, he was speaking of the inefficiency of works to merit salvation. One listener returns to the press, and suddenly he cried out in a tone of thunder. Gosh, I love this. Works, works, a man goes to heaven by works. I would soon think of climbing to the moon on a rope made out of sand.
Yeah.
And the next day he died. And George Whitefield, he was a famous minister during the early 1700s. And during this early part of the colonies, the one thing is I would like to say that we were a colony of religious freedom. We weren't. Certain colonies, depending on where you were more prevalent to what you believed, including places like Pennsylvania. Maryland was actually originally sanctioned as a Catholic colony to where Catholics could go. And William Penn, of course. But the Church of England also held a huge amount of hold through some of these colonies, including during colonial time you actually had to pass a religious test to hold office. And of course you couldn't be Catholic to hold office, because then you were held to the power of the Pope before the people. Now, out of all of this, yes, Miss?
Within Harvard, Yale, and Princeton, since you said they started out religiously, what religion did they?
They started out, of course, as Protestant of one kind or another. And as to what particular denomination, like Princeton actually is formed by the Presbyterians. Do you know which denominations Harvard started out of?
No, I don't actually.
See, that's me. I had to throw Rob under the bus at least once. No. But out of all of this comes something very, very interesting. And out of this comes probably one of the greatest points in early American history, which is, of course, the American Revolution. And probably one of its most famous characters is a gentleman by the name of Peter Muhlenberg. And Peter Muhlenberg was actually a Virginia minister, and he was actually the most famous for being a member as well as an influential propagator of what was known as the Black Regiment. The Black Regiment were members of clergy who influenced the American Army, who actually helped recruit in the Army. And one of the things is, I love this. This is actually from 1776. And it was a Sunday morning, and Muhlenberg was actually giving a regular sermon. And he was actually giving a sermon on Ecclesiastes 3. To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted. And then he came to the end of the sermon. And he turned to his congregation and he said, in the language of the Holy Writ, there was a time for all things, a time to preach and a time to pray, but those times have passed away. And then he actually looked onto the assemblage, and he removed his robes to reveal a Continental officer's uniform. And he said that that time has come to fight, and that time is now. And then he actually went through his congregation, through the church, and he said, "Who is with me?" And 300 of the men left, and actually formed what became known as the 8th Virginia Brigade.
It's like a Patriot.
Yeah, actually, that's what they based that incident from the movie The Patriot actually comes from that. Now, his brother, Frederick Muhlenberg, was not too keen on this, who was also a minister. And so he actually wrote a nasty letter to Peter to basically say, like, what's up with this? You know, we're supposed to almost be impartial to all this is going on around us. And this is what Peter wrote back to him. Peter says, "I am a clergyman, it is true, but I am a member of the society as well as the poorest layman. And my liberty is as dear to me as any man. Shall I then sit and enjoy myself at home when the best blood of the covenant is spilling? So far as I am thinking that I am wrong, I am convinced it is my duty to do so, and my duty I owe to God and to my country." Nobody speaks like that anymore. You get locked away for being crazy. Now, another prominent thing that happens during this time period, happens like right around that time period, of course, the signing of the Declaration of Independence. And this is another thing I always love when people say, America is not a Christian nation. Oh, really? Have you read the Declaration of Independence? And so, I will not read the Declaration of Independence to you. You know why? It is way too long. Okay? And in like, of a paper that's like this big is gripes. Alright? So I don't want to read the gripes. But I will read you certain snippets which tell you of God's hand on this nation. This is out of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station which the laws of nature and nature's God entitled them, a decent respect for the opinions of mankind require that they shall declare the causes which have impelled them to their separation. And then it is said that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then, of course, the closing words on this. And for the support of the Declaration, with firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. No, not a Christian nation at all. Okay? And out of this comes to where the Word of God will actually be invoked to fuel this revolution. Including probably one of the most prominent people that helped do this is Thomas Paine. Okay? First off, I love American Crisis. I love Common Sense. Do not read The Age of Reason. That's Thomas Paine telling you how he feels about organized religion. Ooh. But he does actually use his most famous book, Common Sense. Because what book during this time period is unquestionable?
Bible.
The Bible.
Everybody has
Because everybody had one. But, well, not everybody would have one, but it is that one book that is above every other book. So what would he reference the most? He references the Bible. And one of the things that I love is he uses the Bible as the ammunition for why we should separate from England. And one of the things he says, government by kings was first introduced to the world by the heathens, and from whom the children of Israel copied the custom. It was the most prosperous invention the devil ever sat upon the front premonition of idolatry. The heathens paid honor to their dead kings, and the Christian world hath improved on that plan by doing the same to the living ones. Exalting one man above another cannot be defended upon the authority of Scripture. No man is above another man. The book of Samuel disapproves of kings, and he actually gives it. 1 Samuel 8, 5 through 9, Deuteronomy 17, 14 through 15. For allowances of kings, but they must be Israelite and not follow the practices of other kings. And when Samuel warns them, they insist. And then Judges 8, 22 to 23. When the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule over us, both you and your sons, also your sons' sons, and you will be delivered us from the hands of Midian. But Gideon said unto them, I will not rule, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So again, the use of Scripture in America to influence our ways. Again, don't read Age of Reason. This is one of the things about Thomas Paine I think that's actually very interesting, is that he was actually against kings, and he actually was so successful during the American Revolution, he decided to go over to France to help out the French Revolution, and he will do time in jail for it.
Yeah.
Because he'll actually believe in clemency for the king. Bless you, sir.
Thank you.
And so, while he's in a French jail, I think it's the bitterness of him that started the Age of Reason. Thomas Jefferson. Okay. This is one of my biggest things that I do not like is when somebody says the separation of church and state. Okay. But before we actually get to this, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson not just as an American lawmaker, but remember he is first in Virginia. And he actually, in 1777, puts together the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. And this is actually an act for establishing religious freedom, and this is exactly what it says. Again, guys, that's the reason that I don't want to just say, this is what it says. We're going to read what it says, and then that way you guys are like, oh yeah, well, okay. So it says, whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free, that all attempts to influence by temporal punishments or burden or by civil incapacitations tend only to beget habits of hypocrisy and meanness, and therefore a departure from the plan of the holy author of our religion, who being Lord, both of body and mind, yet chose not to propagate it by coercions on either, as was in his almighty power to do. And then it says that the impious presumption of legislatures and rulers, civil as well as ecclesiastical, who, being themselves but fallible and uninspired men, had assumed dominion over the faith of others, setting up their own opinions and modes of thinking as only true and infallible, and as such endeavoring to impose them upon others, hath established and maintained false religions over the greatest part of the world and through all time, that to compel a man to furnish contributions of money for the propagation of opinions which he disbelieves is sinful and tyrannical. The separation of church and state.
Yeah.
That means we don't have to pay taxes.
Only if those taxes went to the church.
Yeah.
Because that's exactly what was going on.
Yeah.
A portion of your taxes went to paying for the church faith. No, thanks for playing.
Yeah.
Okay? So this is what he's saying, is he's separating, because one of the things that he was known for saying is he said, the government that tells you you must believe in God will then be the government that tells you which God you must believe in. Now, other things that happened during this time period, of course, after we have become, unfortunately, through this war that happened that allowed us to separate from the colonies, we had to like come together as who we were as a new nation, separate from England, and how we are to govern ourselves. And so I'd like to read this. This is actually from the Constitutional Convention. If you guys will bear with me. I'm not like quoting too much, am I? Is this like driving you guys crazy?
Interesting, not at all.
Okay. Be it enacted by General Assembly that no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place, or ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burdened in his body or goods, nor shall otherwise suffer an account of his religious opinions or belief, that all men shall be free to profess, and by argument to maintain their opinions in matter of religion, and that the same shall in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. Okay. Now, when it came to the actual drawing up for a constitution, I always love it when people say, well, it says in our constitution. That's when I'm like, wait, first off, you got to find it in the Constitution. And then, you actually have to give it to me. But during the Constitutional Convention itself, one of the people that came forward to invoke the idea of God himself was Ben Franklin. And this is actually what Ben Franklin said on June 28, 1787. Okay? In the situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when to us, how it has happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought or humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understanding. In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, we were sensible of danger. We had our daily prayers in this room for his divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us were engaged in the struggle, must have observed frequent instances of superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence we owe this happy authority of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend, or do we imagine that we no longer need his guidance? I have lived, sir, for a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men, and if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, it is probable that an empire can rise without his aid. We have been assured, sir, that in the sacred writings that except the Lord build, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his occurring aid, we shall succeed in the political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided in our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down a future age. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter this unfortunate instance despair of establishing government by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg to leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more clergy of the city be requested to officiate in that service.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it was put down.
Oh.
But you can see the importance, the need that they felt. Okay? Now, unfortunately, it didn't pass, But a second motion was made, and on July 4th, which was actually the anniversary for the Declaration of Independence, a convention attendees actually held a special church service under a James Campbell to pray for a free and vigorous government. And in 1789, just 2 years after that speech by Benjamin Franklin, 2 chaplains were hired, one for the House and one for the Senate, which still exists to this day. Now, and of course, we have to talk about this guy. I don't even put his name up there. Okay, I'm like, if you don't know who this guy is, okay, I'll pack your bags and want you out by noon. Alright? Excuse me? What?
GW.
GW.
Good old GW.
Oh yeah. Now, I don't need to tell you what special holiday is coming up. Okay? Which reminds me, we're not meeting next Sunday. You guys know that, right? Don't be here, because I won't be here. Well, no, I'll be downstairs for service at 9, because that's awesome.
Yeah.
I almost forget what that's like. But we will not be meeting for class on Sunday.
Next Sunday?
Yeah, because of the Thanksgiving holiday, my friends. Because a lot of people are going to be out of town. But George Washington is actually, he was the person who enacted in 1789 on October 3rd the proclamation of the first Thanksgiving. And so I love this proclamation. Thank you, George. Okay. To where he said, where it is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey His will, and to be grateful for His benefits, and to humbly to implore His protection and favor. And whereas both the House of Congress have by their joint committees requested me to recommend to the people of the United States a day of public thanksgiving and prayer to be observed by acknowledging with grateful hearts and the many signal favors of the Almighty God, especially by affording them an opportunity proceedably to establish a form of government for their safety and happiness. Now, therefore, I do recommend to assign Thursday, the 25th day of November, next to be devoted by the people of the states to the service to which the great and glorious being, who is the beneficent author of all good that was, that is, and that will be, that we may all unite in rendering unto Him our sincere and humble thanks for His kind care and protection of the people of this country previous to their becoming a nation, for the signal and manifold mercies and the favorable interpositions of His providence, which we experienced in the course of conclusion of the last war, for the great degree of tranquility, union, and plenty which we have since enjoyed, for the peaceable and rational manner in which we have enabled to establish constitutional government for our safety and happiness, and particularly the national one, now lately instituted, for the civil and religious liberty with which we are blessed, and the means we have acquiring and diffusing useful knowledge, and in general for all great various favors which He hath pleased to confer upon us. So Thanksgiving is indeed a high holiday.
Why is it important?
Because we're celebrating God's hand on our nation. You know, so everybody always thinks that it's pilgrims and it's turkey. I don't even like turkey. Okay? But it's much more than that. It's given by our founding father, George Washington, to instruct us to give thanks for what we have become. And through the grace of He who that was all that was good. What is good and shall be.
I think it's interesting that over the last 10 years, it's changed in the culture. The whole focus of Thanksgiving is Black Friday. You
Yeah.
think about it.
Yeah.
It's the sales and the deals and the bargains
Yeah.
to where it's even crept into the day of Thanksgiving.
Yeah,
is
yeah,
when they start their
yeah.
things, and I just think that cleverness and subtleness of the enemy at work, where even our one day where being thankful is, no, it's actually now about greed.
Yeah.
About going and getting and getting and getting and getting the best deal and all that kind of stuff, and I just think,
And it's the same thing that's been happening for the past 20, 30 years for Christmas.
exactly.
Taking the eyes away of what it was supposed to represent.
Yeah,
Uh,
I know.
it's unfortunate that Satan's a capitalist.
Fuels to our greed.
Yeah, appeals to our need of greed.
Oh, man.
And so that is our first Thanksgiving. And I think that is absolutely moving, that being giving. And it's really interesting that there's a reason like that we're giving, I don't know, divine providence, that we're talking about this today. You know, for both the Mayflower Compact and Thanksgiving. It's divine providence of God upon us all. Okay? But we also know what happens. Look at any culture that does not follow the divine providence of God. Okay. So, let's go ahead and we are not closing it out. Because let's directly talk about the separation of church and state. Okay? As a lot of people say, I love this, but they're like, it's in the Constitution. It is not in the Constitution. Nowhere in the Constitution does it mention anything about the separation of church and state. Okay? There is a letter to the Danbury Baptist Association in Connecticut, done by Jefferson. Bye-bye. Enjoy pancakes.
Yeah.
Okay?
Little restless thing.
Done in January 1st, 1802. And he says, in this letter, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act as a whole American people which declared that their federal legislature should make no law respecting a state establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state.
Who wrote that again?
Thomas Jefferson, 1802. And it's a personal letter that was then published in a newspaper. And Jefferson was actually echoing the words of the founder of the First Baptist Church of America, a gentleman by the name of Roger Williams, who wrote, in of all things, 1644, so Jefferson obviously owned his book. Thomas Jefferson owned the largest library in the colonies at the time, by the way. And he actually said in his book, a hedge or wall of separation between the garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. That does not mean separation of church and state. Okay, but I love that. The garden of the church and the wilderness of the world. Because let me tell you, the world is wild. Okay? Yeah, in several colonies, the establishment ceased to exist in the practices. And then in 1789, the Georgia Constitution was amended to follow. Article 4, Section 10, no person within the state shall upon any pretense be deprived of an inestimable privilege of worshiping God in any manner agreeable to his own conscience, nor be compelled to attend any place or worship contrary to his own faith and judgment, nor shall he ever be obliged to pay tithes, taxes, or any other rate for the building or repairing any place of worship, or for the maintenance of any minister or ministry contrary to what he believes to be right, or hath voluntarily engaged to do so. No one religious society shall ever be established in this state in preference to another, nor shall any person be denied the employment of any civil right merely on account of his religious principles. 1789. Okay, so basically it's saying that if you didn't believe in a certain religious faith, there should be no reason why you should be forced to pay for their church. Because that's exactly what was happening. And then, of course, the New Hampshire Constitution requires members of the state legislature to be of the Protestant religion. Catholics could not run for office. the North Carolina Constitution in 1776 disestablished the Anglican Church, and it wasn't until 1835 the North Carolina Constitution allowed Protestants only to hold public office. Religious tolerance for Catholics with an established Church of England was policy in the Spanish colonies as well, and with the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which ended the American Revolution, the British ceded both East and West Florida back to Spain. And so that, in the end, is our American heritage.
Cool.
Okay? Now, we're going to take a little hiatus, mostly because we're probably still going to be in bed digesting Thanksgiving. Okay? But next time, we're going to talk about several movers during the 19th century, including William Wilberforce and others, on the abolition of slavery. And we're going to be moving our way into definitely more modern times. I want to thank you guys for coming. Yes, sir.
To answer your question about Harvard and Yale, while he was speaking of things I already knew about, I looked it up for him. Harvard, although never formally affiliated with any denomination, the early college primarily trained Congregational and Unitarian clergy. In regards to Harvard, I'm sorry, in regards to Yale, I apologize. Established by clergy in Saybrook Colony to educate congregational ministers, which when I tapped on that, it said basically Protestantism.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions or anything like that?
Were there any colonies or states or whatever, whatever political.
Okay, yeah.
At the time of the revolution or post-revolution, where members of the Anglican Church
Could hold office?
could not.
Oh, almost all of them.
Specifically.
Yeah.
So they're, okay.
Almost all of them could not. Well, for the Anglican Church
In the US.
in the U.S.
In the new US.
Yes. Hold on. I didn't think I
Thinking about
even
how
have a
the
note
king
on
was
that.
So, and was the king back at the time of the US Revolution? Was the king still basically the head of the Anglican Church?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
And they're still viewed that way.
Oh.
Yeah. Let's see. Do I have something for Anglican? Okay, yeah, Church of England actually still have a hold that, I don't know about running for office, but they did have a hold in New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. While Maryland was Catholic, and New York, New Jersey, Delaware, and Connecticut would be various Protestant faiths, which actually went under this giant balloon, which they called the Dutch Reformed Church.
Oh.
So, which would include like Amish, Quaker, stuff like that. Okay?
Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you so much. You guys have a wonderful Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.